finding her own purpose in a world that expected women to, well, stay at home and bake cookies.
Yeah, I get it. So she joins the Army Nurse Corps,
And she gets a harsh reality check when she arrives at the 36th Evacuation Hospital in Vietnam. Imagine this. She actually packed a pretty dress for parties, along with her medical supplies.
A dress for party.
Welcome to Witter. Who Has Time to Read? The podcast that brings deep dives for busy minds. Listen to AI hosts Jane and Dane and get ready to unpack the world's most captivating books in just a fraction of the time. Whether commuting, working out, or just squeezing in a quick break, we deliver key insights, thought-provoking themes, and takeaways you can carry into your day. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Plus, use our links in the description to purchase this book. Your support helps us bring more engaging book discussions to you. Listen and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Who has time to read? You do, with Witter.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're doing something kind of different. You've given us Kristin Hannah's novel, The Women, and asked us to use it to understand the Vietnam War experience.
Yeah, using fiction to unpack history, it's a unique approach.
Right. But I think it'll be really powerful. So, no dry historical facts today. We're going deep into the story of Frankie McGrath, an Army nurse in Vietnam, to see the war through her eyes.
Exactly. And what's so powerful about Frankie's story is how it captures that initial naivete, that almost romanticized view of the war that many people had, especially in those early years.
Totally. Like at the beginning of the book, Frankie's brother is shipping out with the Navy, and her family throws this big celebratory send-off.
It's like they're totally oblivious to what awaits him or what Frankie will face in Vietnam.
And then, bam, the scene shifts to the 12th Evacuation Hospital, and it's like a punch to the gut. The heat, the chaos, the never-ending stream of wounded soldiers. Hannah does not sugarcoat it.
Not at all. She gives these incredibly vivid and often very difficult to read descriptions of the soldiers' injuries. You really get a sense of the brutal physical toll of the war.
It's heavy stuff, but it makes you think about what those nurses, those young men and women, must have witnessed day in and day out. How do you even begin to process that?
Well, that's where the novel really highlights the importance of human connection in the face of trauma. Frankie forms these incredibly strong bonds with her fellow nurses, Barb and Ethel.
Their friendship becomes this lifeline, this little bubble of sanity in the middle of all that madness, right?
Exactly. Their dark humor, their shared experiences, it all helps them cope. And it makes you think about how vital that kind of support system was, especially for those who came back from Vietnam to a society that didn't really understand what they'd been through.
It's tragic. So many veterans felt so isolated when they came home. Like they couldn't relate to the people they'd left behind, and those people couldn't relate to them.
Absolutely, and Hannah captures that sense of disconnect so well. But beyond that, what struck me was how vividly she portrays daily life in Vietnam beyond just the battlefield.
It's like you're right there with Frankie, feeling the oppressive heat, tasting that ever-present red dust.
Yeah, and even those little details, like Frankie complaining about having to wear pantyhose in a war zone.
Right. It sounds trivial, but it's those everyday struggles that make it all so real, so relatable.
Exactly. They remind us that this was real life for the people who were there, men and women. And speaking of real life, Hannah doesn't shy away from exploring the complexities of love and loss during wartime.
Frankie's experiences are definitely complicated, to say the least.
There's Jamie, a married surgeon, and their relationship really highlights the moral dilemmas that can arise in those extreme circumstances.
And then there's Rye, the Navy pilot, who just completely sweeps Frankie off her feet. Their relationship is so intense, so passionate, but always with this shadow of war hanging over them.
Because they know at any moment it could all be ripped away.
Exactly. And tragically, both relationships end in loss. Jamie is killed during a bombing, and Rye's plane is shot down and he's presumed dead, though that's not quite the end of his story.
These losses are devastating for Frankie, and they really set the stage for her incredibly difficult journey home, which we'll talk about when we come back. You know, we often focus on the physical dangers of war, but The Women really makes you think about the psychological battle that came after for so many who served. Like Frankie, she comes home expecting this triumphant return, and it's just not that.
It's rough. Her family's reaction is just so cold. They're distant. They barely even want to look at her. It's like they're ashamed of her.
They were. It's actually mentioned that they lied to their friends and neighbors about where Frankie had been, said she was working at a hospital in San Diego.
Wow. They couldn't even admit she was serving her country in Vietnam.
It's a really powerful example of the shame and stigma that so many Vietnam vets faced. Their country didn't even want to acknowledge the war, let alone what the people who fought in it had gone through.
And for Frankie, it's like that rejection just made all the trauma she's carrying so much worse.
Exactly. She's dealing with nightmares, flashbacks, she's lost Jamie, she doesn't know what happened to Rai. And then to be treated like an outsider by your own family on top of all that.
How do you even process all of that?
A lot of vets couldn't. We see Frankie struggling too. She isolates herself, can't hold down a job, even tries to take her own life. It's really tough to read, but it's important.
Sadly, it's the reality a lot of veterans faced. And it really points to how unequipped society was to deal with the invisible wounds of war.
Absolutely. PTSD wasn't really understood, and there just wasn't adequate support for veterans. And the novel doesn't offer any easy answers. Frankie's path to healing is long and difficult, with a lot of setbacks along the way.
So what changes for Frankie?
It's actually through connecting with other veterans that things start to shift. They get it, they understand what she's going through in a way that her family just can't.
And Barb, her friend from the hospital, she becomes this incredible source of strength for Frankie.
For sure, she helps connect Frankie to this whole community of veterans who are all fighting for their own recovery, but also for recognition and justice for what they all went through.
Which leads to Frankie getting involved in the anti-war movement. It's interesting because in the beginning, it almost seems like anger is fueling her activism.
Oh, definitely. There's anger there, for sure. But as the story progresses, you start to see that it becomes about more than just anger. It's about taking her pain and channeling it into something meaningful, something that could help create change.
Right, finding purpose in all that pain. It's powerful.
And the way Hannah depicts the anti-war movement, she shows how incredibly divisive it was, not just through the big protests, but also those smaller everyday moments.
Yeah, like just the way some people look at Frankie when she's in her uniform.
Like they're judging her, right? It's like there's this unspoken pressure to just forget about the war, pretend it never happened. But of course, for people like Frankie, forgetting isn't an option.
They lived it, and they're still living with the consequences.
Exactly. And that's why stories like Frankie's are so important. They force us to face the truth about war, the long-lasting impacts, and to have empathy for the people who carry those burdens along after the fighting's over.
One aspect that really stayed with me was the portrayal of the POW MIA issue, how families were left in limbo, not knowing the fate of their loved ones. It's something we don't often hear much about.
Absolutely. The women really brings that to the forefront and shows how agonizing that uncertainty was for countless families. Remember the League of Families in the book?
Oh yeah, the organization started by the wives of POWs and MIAs.
Those women were fierce advocates. They demanded answers from the government. They refused to let their husbands and sons be forgotten. And Frankie gets involved with them, right?
She does. She uses her voice and her experience to help raise awareness, to support those families. It's actually really powerful because it shows how the war didn't really end for a lot of people when the troops came home.
No, not at all. It shows this other side, the families who were left behind and their strength and determination in the face of unimaginable uncertainty.
The enduring power of hope and love. It's incredible, really. But, you know, the novel doesn't shy away from the darker aspects of a soldier's experience either. Like with moral injury, that's a heavy concept.
It is. You see Frankie struggling with this, the weight of the decisions she had to make, things she had to do or not do during the war, things that just wouldn't even cross your mind in peacetime.
You really feel for her, for what she carries with her.
It's a reminder that the things soldiers experience can challenge their very sense of right and wrong, their humanity. And sometimes those scars are the deepest ones of all, the ones you can't see.
You know, as we've been talking about Frankie and everything she went through, there's this one image from the book that keeps coming back to me. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in D.C. The way Hannah describes it, it's just so powerful.
Oh, absolutely. It's such a stark, moving memorial. That wall of black granite etched with all those names.
It's more than just names, though, right? It represents all those lives cut short, all that potential, all those families forever changed by the war.
Exactly. And Hannah captures Frankie's reaction to the memorial so perfectly. That sense of being completely overwhelmed, the sheer number of names, the weight of it all.
There's that scene, I think it's toward the end, where Frankie goes to the memorial with other veterans and she's just overcome with emotion.
For her, it becomes this really cathartic experience, like finally being able to confront all that grief and trauma she's been carrying for so long.
And to share that experience with others who understand, who are there.
That shared connection is so important. It's like The memorial provides this space for healing, a way to move forward without erasing the past. But Hannah also touches on the controversy surrounding the memorial's design, right?
Yeah, some people thought it was too simple, too minimalist. They wanted something grander, more traditional.
Right, something that screamed heroism in a more obvious way.
But I actually think Hannah makes a really good point about the power of that simplicity. Just those names etched in the granite, it really lets you sit with the magnitude of the loss.
It forces you to confront it head on in a way that a more traditional monument might not. It's a conversation starter, for sure. And it's funny, thinking back to when we first started this deep dive into the women, I was a little unsure what to expect. Could a novel really give us a deeper understanding of something as complex as the Vietnam War?
Right. Like, how much could fiction really tell us about such a significant historical event?
But I have to say, I'm impressed. Hannah really captures the human cost of the war, and not just for the soldiers.
Exactly. We see it with the nurses, the families, even back home in the States.
It's a good reminder that war impacts everyone, not just the people on the front lines.
Absolutely. And those experiences, the fear, the camaraderie, the heartbreak, the resilience, those are all universal. We might not all experience war, but we can all relate to those emotions.
Exactly. And the things Frankie goes through, coming home to a country that doesn't understand, trying to heal from trauma, trying to find her place in the world again, those are struggles that so many veterans face, even today.
Which is why it's so important to keep these conversations going.
Right.
If anything we've talked about today resonated with you, if Frankie's story has sparked your curiosity, don't let it end here.
There are so many incredible resources out there, memoirs by Vietnam vets, documentaries, museums. There's an organization called the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. They do some amazing work.
And don't underestimate the power of stories, even fictional ones like the women.
Exactly. Seek them out, listen to them, learn from them. They can teach us so much about ourselves, about humanity.
And maybe, just maybe, they can help us create a world where stories like Frankie's are a little less common.